Good morning, good afternoon, or even good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to our webinar. We'll give it a minute or so everybody can join onto the webinar, and then we'll get cracking. So it'll be quiet for about a minute, and then we'll get to it.
I could hum some music if you like.
Oh, that would be great. Feel like some elevator music just in the background. Okay, well, let's get cracking to it. So welcome to the webinar. This is Preparing Modern SharePoint Environments for Multilingual Use, and it's hosted by Rencore in conjunction with Icefire. And with me, I have Martin. Welcome, Martin.
Hello, Liam. Nice to meet you virtually.
Indeed. Just so everybody knows, if you wish to ask a question during the webinar, please use the Q&A window. The chat window is obviously there for chatting. It just makes it more complicated to manage the questions. So please feel free to put them in the Q&A. And at the end, or towards the end of the webinar, we'll get to answering some of those questions. Just so you know, you will get a copy of the webinar, the recording as well. Everybody who's registered will receive that probably a day or so after it's completed. So we're looking forward to this one. So I'll get straight to it and turn the time over to Martin, and we'll be in his safe, capable hands, and then you'll get to hear from me again towards the end. So Martin, the time is all yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Liam. I will, my name is Martin Laplante. I'm with PointFire, and my specialization is languages in SharePoint and other SharePoint-like Office 365 products. So what I'm going to start with is a demo of something completely different. It is a feature in PowerPoint that allows me to subtitle in any language that I like. And in this case, I'm doing subtitles in Danish. So if everyone is watching the bottom of the screen, this is PowerPoint, which is listening to what I say and translating into Danish and showing it to you. This is a feature that you can also get in some other Office 365 or Microsoft 365 products, including Teams that I'll be talking about. And it's one of the many language-related features of Office 365 that are coming out one by one. It's amazing technology. I'll turn it off because people find it very distracting. So what we're going to talk about in this session is we're going to talk about the new topology of what it means to have modern SharePoint sites, how that's different from the old days, and the old days is just a couple of years back. How that changes how language is going to be handled in an organization that has multiple languages. So modern sites are different. They have a new multilingual first approach. We'll talk about what that means. Variations are on their way out. MUI, multilingual user interface, is one of the other features that I'll be talking about. This is a feature of SharePoint that is going to become more prominent. We're going to talk about Teams and how Teams handles multiple languages. If there's time, we'll talk a little bit about how to localize apps so that they work in multiple languages. We'll talk about provisioning of sites and of users from multiple languages. And then we'll talk about the new generation of machine translation that is coming out. Some very exciting new research and some very rapid taking that research and putting it into production. So before any of that, we will talk about the old days of Office 365. Cast your memory back all the way to last year. So once upon a time, transnational organizations had separate SharePoint farms in different countries and different regions. you had a farm in one country, you had another, if you opened an office in another country, you probably had a SharePoint farm in that other country. And each of these farms and the site collections into these farms could have their own language. You didn't have to worry about languages, about farms having the same language in all the different countries. Then came Office 365, and Office 365 has tenants, not farms. So the question that has to be asked then, if you are an organization that works in different countries, is should you have one tenant, one global tenant, or should you have many regional tenants? Why would you want to have regional tenants? Well, sometimes there are laws in some countries that say that data can't be stored in another region, can't be stored abroad. There are laws like that in the EU. There are laws like that in Canada. Many countries have laws that govern data, the location of data. Then there's network latency. The further away is your server, then the worse the performance is going to be. So there are some reasons why you might want to have regional tenants. On the other hand, in Office 365, the boundaries between tenants are completely impenetrable. They're treated like competitors. If your company decides to have two different tenants, there's no way to share information between those two tenants. It's no more easy to share information between the two than it is to share information with one of your competitors. So, so that's a very good argument not to have regional tenants, to have one single one. But now there's a new feature since last year in Office 365 called Multi-geo. So Multi-geo is a way in which you can have a single tenant, and yet the data for people in one country can be stored in that country, whereas the data for people in another country can be stored in a different country. So with multi-geo, the regional tenant argument, the legal argument about data location, and the network argument about latency doesn't hold. So residency can be, data residency, the country of data residency can be controlled all within the same tenant. So really the best answer is to have a single tenant, a single global tenant, one tenant to rule them all, one tenant to allow you to find things. That's a rough quote from The Lord of the Rings. I'm sure that's what Tolkien meant. So what we had with classic on-premise sites was what you call physical topology. You had multiple farms, and each of these farms corresponded to a region. Within that farm, you could have individual languages. So you can have sites within a group of sites that had a language. So they were physically separated, and the topology, the hierarchy, was fixed. If you were using variations on classic sites, then variations themselves are subsites. So you would have a function, and within that function, you would have within the same site collection different language versions as separate sites physically located on the same farm, on the same servers in the same region. But now what we have with modern sites is a completely different sort of topology. It is not a physical topology, it is a logical topology. You can have flat, much less hierarchical organization of your sites. You can organize them any way that you want. It doesn't have to be regional, and in fact, regional isn't forced on you anymore like it was with the multiple farm model. And what's more, you can change the association between a site and a hub site, and you can change one to associate with a different hub site. You can do that dynamically. So it is a logical topology. It's not physical. and it is flexible. And what that means is that rather than language being essentially towards the bottom of the hierarchy, towards the leaf, the bottom of the roots, then what you have is language can be organized in all sorts of different ways. So when I'm talking about topology of hub sites, I'm sure you'll find all sorts of other webinars that will tell you a lot more about hub sites. But from a language point of view, hub sites can be modern or they can be classic. But the sites that are associated with hubs, I call them spokes. I may be the only person who calls them spokes. I don't know. The sites can be modern or they can be classic. So any site, any spoke site associated with a hub can be a subsite of another site, can have subsites. And this includes variation labels. If you have classic sites, you can have individual variation labels, which are essentially subsites associated with one hub or another hub. So what that means is whether you use variations or not, whether you use classic sites and subsites or not, you can have a mix of old topologies and new topologies. So if you are migrating over to the new flat world, you can either leave language in place as something that is at the bottom of your site topology, or you can adopt a new way of doing things, which is multilingual first. And multilingual first is what modern SharePoint tends to prefer to do. So just to let you know a little bit about hub sites language features, there are two major ones. One of them is hub navigation is localizable. There's some people who'll tell you that hub site navigation is not localizable, that you can't have it in multiple language. It is confusing the way that it works because hub navigation gets cached. So you can put in some localization and it won't appear right away, but it's there. So you can have hub sites, hub navigation that will work in any language if you set it up with all the languages. What you can also do, which is useful, is it's possible to generate news in different languages, and hub sites will show you news, and it's possible to use the news web part to filter your news according to language. So you can make a site that will go and show news from the hub site, and that will show news from the hub site only in your language. So you can generate news in all the languages of your organization, and then any individual user can have a filtered view of that news, filtered according to their language. So the news that they see is the news in their own language. And there are a couple of ways to do that. The news web part is a little rudimentary in the way that it filters. It gets better all the time, but you can make language a page property. So when you create a news item, you can give it a language and use the news web part to filter according to that page property. If you're using the highlighted content web part, you can automatically detect, you can filter by this managed property called detected language. Detected language is a wonderful property, a managed property that will look at the language in which this page or this news item or whatever it is has been created, determine what the most likely language is, and then you can set a filter by that value, and you can filter according to the language that SharePoint has detected. Another thing that you can do now is you can use audience targeting. You can determine which news should be seen by whom. You can use language, or you can use countries as one of the ways in which to target the audience. So how modern sites differ from classic. So classic sites, when you create them, are created from a template which is very language specific. So by default, this template has a single language. Modern sites, on the other hand, the site templates that are used to create modern sites are not very language specific. Same template is used in multiple languages. When you create a modern site, by default, it's going to have 51 languages activated, not just one, like what happens with classic sites. Variations is a feature that was there in classic publishing sites, not available in modern anymore. If we get to it, localization of classic site used to be done using one technique. On modern sites, it is done with a completely different technique. So there is a feature. So even though the site template is not very language specific, there is a feature which is available, which is that you can create a new modern site that wasn't there a year ago, a new modern site in a specific language. So the question is that useful? So we're going to show you a demo. And I'll warn you right now, it's a very disappointing demo. Liam, you've probably seen some bad demos in your time of SharePoint.
Just a few.
So this, I mean, I promise you, this is one of the worst demos that you'll ever seen. This is something to remember. I promise that you will be disappointed. So I will go and create a brand new site, modern communication site. I will create it in Arabic. If anyone here understands Arabic, first of all, marhaban. We may need your help later on. None of us speaks any Arabic. I'm about to create a site in Arabic, and I may not understand anything that it says. So let's use this feature and create a site. And I will make it a communication site. And I will call it an Arabic site. And down here, you see, I can select a language. So I am going to select Arabic as the language, a right to left language. This should be very, very confusing. And create the site, press on finish, and in a few seconds, what we have is, come on, come on, come on. Just a little bit of patience. We should see a brand new Arabic language site having been created. Come on, little spinner, you can do this. Okay, so remember that we have said that modern SharePoint sites are multilingual first. And multilingual first means, and here it is, an Arabic site. And what has happened? Well, this is very, very disappointing. Unless Arabic is a lot easier to understand than you'd think, the site seems to be completely in English, almost completely in English. You just see a tiny snippet of Arabic here, but any page that you go to, you'll see it seems to be completely in English. We asked it to create it in Arabic. It seems to be completely in English, almost completely in English. Okay, so what has happened here? Why am I seeing everything in English? So what's happened is that if I go to the site settings and look at the language settings of this site, we will see what languages are on this site. So the default language of this site is Arabic, just as I told it. However, it's created the site with every single alternate language activated. And my personal language preference is English. And therefore, it is showing me this new Arabic site entirely in English. Even this text, the hero web part, is entirely in English on this Arabic site. Okay, so this is really all I wanted to show you of this very disappointing demo. Create the site in Arabic, and the site seems to be entirely in English. So what has happened here? So the site template has a language. In the same way, the site templates in classic sites have languages. However, this adapts to all languages. All the alternate languages are turned on. So modern sites automatically have all of the languages that SharePoint supports. And it's going to follow the user's language preference. All the content on all the pages is generated dynamically. So if you were to look at the SPFX files that it creates for these sites, these SPFX files are essentially empty. They're empty shells. They're containers that are dynamically filled using JavaScript. It's all client-side rendering. So, and that includes the initial page content, the sample text of the hero web part. The hero web part doesn't have any hard-coded text when you create it. It has sample text, and that sample text will be rendered to you in the user's language. It's not stored in the SPFX file itself. So what is different when you create it in another language? Some internal list and library names are different, but otherwise, my username as administrator, I think it calls me, so it shows that to me in Arabic. But really, apart from some internal coding, which is really more of an inconvenience than a help, it will look not to the site language, it will look to the user language to determine how things are rendered. So it will only look to the site language if the user has no valid language selection. So SharePoint Online has a number of language features. On the surface, they look the same for modern sites as they did for classic sites, but they're used in a way that is much more flexible, much more responsive to the user's own language. Variations is not one of them. Variations doesn't apply to modern sites. Variations it has not been called deprecated by itself, but it is essentially deprecated. SharePoint has a machine translation service. This is a web service on SharePoint servers, and in SharePoint Online, it's still there, but it's deprecated. So if you create a variation site and try to use machine translation on it, the option is no longer there. Some features of the machine translation service, for instance, using the term store, you can still get to the machine translation service to translate term store terms, and you can use it from API. It is very slow. It's essentially gone. Managed metadata has always been multilingual. You could always localize it in multiple languages. That's still there. The MUI, the multilingual user interface, which is a way in which user interface elements can have labels in different languages. That's there. That's there out of the box. It is used more than it used to be in Classic. So as I was saying, SharePoint Online, variations, labels. If you had existing ones, they're there, but machine translation is no longer there. Modern sites have never supported variations at all. So SharePoint variations is essentially deprecated. In SharePoint 2019 as well, SharePoint 2019 says that machine translation services will remain supported, but deprecated. In actual fact, it doesn't work at all in SharePoint 2019 either. So one of the things that the deprecation announcements about the machine translation service have said in Microsoft is maybe you should use the Bing API. And for anyone who's ever tried this, that's not going to work. First of all, it's not called the Bing API, it's called the Azure Text Translator API. And it doesn't work for a number on modern pages. It doesn't work for a number of reasons. First of all, it can support HTML, but the SPFX that you see on SharePoint sites, it doesn't like that HTML. A lot of the text isn't actually in that SPFX file, so even if you translate it, most of the text isn't even in there. It's not in translatable form, so this is not something that can easily be used. So right now, there is no replacement for the old machine translation service, particularly for modern pages. So multilingual user interface, I mentioned before, that is the way in which you have different language labels for user interface elements. So every site has a base language. Sites can have alternate languages, and a user has language preferences. So there are lots of things in SharePoint that will follow the user's language preferences, and I'll tell you a little bit more about how that works. First of all, these MUI elements are things like names and titles and descriptions for site names, navigation nodes, list, column names, content type names, custom actions, list views. So there are a number of those things that will change the text that they display depending on the user's language preference. And they can be changed manually. They can be changed programmatically. But a lot of the translations are already built in, so you don't have to enter them at all. So how do you know what the user's language setting is? Is it your browser? Is it your profile? What is it? So it's actually a relatively complicated story. So let me go through it step by step. So first of all, a site has got a base language and it's got some alternate languages. So these are the list of languages that can possibly be switched to when you look at a site based on your language. So which language preference is it? Well, let's start with browser settings. So every browser has a ranked list of language preferences. Your first language, second, third, and so forth. So SharePoint will go through the list of languages in your browser, all other things being equal. Pick one that matches one of the base or alternate languages, set the language to that. All other things being equal, other things are hardly ever equal. Because there is also your profile setting. So in SharePoint Online, you will have a user profile that may very well include your language preference. So if you have a language preference in your user profile, it's going to ignore the browser settings. Okay, simple. We're not there yet. In addition to your user profile, you also have an account language setting. So your account language is going to affect your user profile language. When you change it, you change your account setting, it's going to change your user profile language preferences, which in turn affects other parts of Office 365. This user profile language is synchronized with Azure Active Directory. So there is a property in Azure Active Directory which can be set in advance, or and that's going to set your user profile, or you can change your user profile. That's going to change your Azure Active Directory language preference. Okay, are we there yet? No, we're not. Because in fact, it is not the user profile that SharePoint follows. It is user properties that are site collection specific. This is a relic from an old version of SharePoint Online, but what it means is that every site has got its own user settings. And whenever you change your user profile, either directly through the user profile or through the account language or through Active Directory, it's going to set up a timer job so that a few minutes later, it's going to change your user properties on every site. This is why when you change your language using your user profile, it's going to take a few minutes for it to show up. It's going to show up on some sites before other sites. It takes about 10 minutes altogether. Okay, are we there? We're mostly there if you're using modern. If you are using classic, there's an additional wrinkle in that some of the add-ins could have their own languages. People don't use add-ins anymore. So when you're using modern customization using SPFX, you don't have to worry about these add-in site settings matching the host site settings. All right. There are some questions piling up. Should I deal with a couple of the questions?
Yeah, if you want to take the first question. So your personal language preference default, is it browser-based or from your user profile? Obviously, that goes with what you just talked about.
That's what I just talked about. It is a combination of the two. So the user profile will override the browser.
And the second question for you, as a developer, where from can I get the current user language?
So that depends whether you're on a classic or a modern site. And so it's a complicated answer. Maybe I'll get to it a little bit later on, and there's some of it on my blog. I wish there were a consistent way to do it, but unfortunately there isn't.
Okay. We'll leave the other ones for now, and then we'll do those after.
All right. So I was talking about changing your user profile language settings, and it is a simple 11-step process. So you click on your photo, then that will bring you to a menu where you click on My Office Profile, then you click on Update Profile, then scroll down to the bottom of the page, and there's a question saying, how can I change my language and regional settings? Expand that, click on the word here, and that will bring you to this page. Click on the ellipsis, the 3 dots, that will bring you to seeing this language and regions. Once you're there, inside here is My Display Language. You can pick and add or re-rank languages. Then you scroll down to the bottom, click Save All and Close, and wait for 10 minutes. Something which is interesting, among these display languages, you get a lot of them. Most of them are not supported. So you can change your language to Upper Sorbian or to Mohawk or to various other languages which are there for mysterious reasons. Select them, it will have absolutely no effect. What you can select is either SharePoint supported languages like English, French, Spanish, and so forth. And if you have variants of those like English UK, English US, English Canada, so forth, it's going to do the mapping to the version of English that SharePoint supports. So it does some limited mapping if you choose a language which is not in the SharePoint supported list. Plus, there are some settings that have no effect at all because it's not a SharePoint supported language. I was talking about your account settings. Your account settings are, oh, I highlighted the wrong thing in the slide. It should be the very last one. The language setting right at the bottom, that will affect a fair bit of the Office 365 interface, including SharePoint. But it does that indirectly because when you change that language setting, it's going to actually change your user profile setting as well. The two are independent, but changing one changes the other, if you know what I mean. There are lots of other language settings in Office 365. So there are some Office 365 products that will follow the same settings as the profile settings. Some of them follow the Office 365 account settings. Some of them follow the browser settings, and some have their own settings. And that includes Teams. So Outlook will follow Office 365 account settings, but it also has its own settings which can override it. Teams has a completely independent language setting, which is independent of the setting of SharePoint. So you can have Teams in one language and SharePoint in the other. And if you have any SharePoint components showing up on your Teams site, they can be in 2 different languages. All great fun. Someday, Microsoft is going to have fewer language settings, but each of these products has some reasons why it sometimes needs its own language settings. So here is a trick. Rather than going to change your profile language and waiting 10 minutes, that takes a long time, particularly if you are trying to populate the MUI, particularly if you're a developer or a content author and you want to see the other languages. There is a trick to using your browser settings rather than your profile settings to determine your SharePoint language. So the first thing, optional, that's only if you've been messing with your languages and things are going wrong, is you can change your account setting. Then if you make your profile settings blank, so have no language profile settings, and then wait for a while for it to consider this. It takes several minutes, sometimes hours, for it to realize that that's blank. Then you can change your browser settings, and in the absence of any profile settings, your browser settings are going to be what determines SharePoint's language. And changing your browser settings is instantaneous. Changing profile setting is not. So if you need to do this, then use this trick. That's an instant toggle. Obviously, you can't train all your users to do that. There are only a few power users who can use this, but it's very quick. It's very efficient. So what does that mean in terms of governance? We were talking about governance. What does that mean? You have one global site. You have all these language settings. Things can appear in different languages. You have to create interface. You have to create content. So let's start with manage metadata content type, because that hasn't changed. Manage metadata and content type can be centralized. And if you centralize that, then the translation of the text that's associated with managed metadata with content type is also centralized. This is not a new challenge. This has always been there, except that it used to be on separate farms, separate regional farms. Now, if you're centralizing it, then somebody at head office or somebody who's responsible for all of this is also responsible for the translations. When it comes to the user interface, every modern site is potentially multilingual. It gets created that way. So you should prepare the MUI for all the languages you're going to support. You should also probably think when you're creating sites to turn off some of the alternate languages that you don't want to support. So anytime that you're creating UI elements, you should consider what the translation is going to be. Every time you're creating content that might be multilingual. There isn't a good way of doing that right now, except for a third-party add-in. Well, except for me. For me, it's a first-party add-in. But there is no good way of translating content right now for modern sites. But if you do translate content for modern sites, then you have to have some governance changes. So for instance, for news, you have to determine what you're going to translate, who's going to approve the translations. So the people who are generating this content, the communications group or health and safety or whoever it is that's generating this content now has to figure out how to translate that content. That used to be a regional issue, that now becomes a central issue. If you're creating hubs, navigation has to be translated. So that becomes a central issue, no longer a regional issue. News should be tagged by language. So localization can't be left to regions anymore. Localization of interface, localization of content can't be left to regions. The people who are responsible for generating text will also become responsible for translation. And this becomes a problem because very often they won't know the other languages that are being used in the site, even though this has to be entered on their own sites on which they have control. So what you need is to figure out a method of collaboration between the people who use the text and understand the language and the people who generate the text and may not understand the language. Unfortunately, we're running low on time, so I won't have a lot of time to elaborate on this. If we want to talk a little bit about team sites. So modern team sites can be associated with Microsoft Teams, or they can be independent. Modern team sites are things that are like collaboration sites. So they support multilingual in the same way as collaboration. I will rush through this part of it so we can talk about Teams itself. Microsoft Teams itself has got some multilingual features independent of the features, multilingual features of SharePoint on which Teams is hosted. And there's some really cool features there. So it's got its own language setting. This language setting affects the language of the Teams interface. It affects the date and time format. It's got a cool feature of translation of contents. And it's got, for Teams live events, it's got live captions and translation, like what I showed at the beginning of the talk. So this is maybe a little difficult to see, but in the team settings, you can select your language, and here you're selecting a combination of the language in the country. The language determines the language of the interface. The country determines the format of dates and currencies and so forth. There is, when you have conversations, when you have chats within Teams, you can have a feature where you see some text in another language, you can use the drop-down menu to translate it. That feature is not on by default. I won't go through the details here. Essentially, in order to use it, there's a long introduction of commands, but the important command here is set CS Teams messaging policy, and there's something called allow user translation. That's what gets that little translation option in the menu, and then it works like Facebook, for instance, where if you see something in a different language, you can get instantly a translation of what that means. That's very good for collaboration across different countries. So after having set that command, what you'll see is allow user translation is set to true. When that's the case, then you get that little menu option of showing the translation. I don't have a great deal of time to talk about localization. I will rush through this. The people who want to look at the slides, who want to read the code and see how it works, can go ahead and do this. Localization of SharePoint apps, SharePoint modern apps, is done differently from what it was with Classic. With Classic, it was a bit of a hack that you had to find strings and replace them on pages, and it was a bit of a roundabout way of localizing. So localization versus globalization, Microsoft uses both terms. You have to be aware when it uses that. Localization means that it changes language according to the site's own language. Globalization means that it changes language according to the user's language. The localization model has been all but abandoned. We have globalization now. It is assumed that any app that you write is going to support all the languages that will be on your site. So when you were using Classic in the add-in model, there was one way of doing it. For SPFX, for modern pages, it is a great deal easier. Someone was asking earlier how you find the language. If you are within SPFX, this is the way that you do it. There is something which is available from within SPFX web parts, SPFX applications inside that context that will tell you the language in which the user is doing things. But it's got built-in localization. It's got a very good method of doing it. I'm not going to go through the code, but you can translate the manifest, and within the application itself, you can create some labels. You can create multiple files that are similar to resource files that will give you the value of strings in different languages, and use that within your code. That's going to respond to the user's language, not the site language. PNP as well has got some localization. So if you're provisioning a site and using PNP for site provisioning, it has a way using resource files and tokens to provision sites in multiple different languages. It's very cool. If you're into automated provisioning, look into this. It's much easier than provisioning separately in different languages. So if you're provisioning users, then you have to remember that there is a user profile property, which is the list of languages that the users a ranked list of languages that the user is comfortable with reading. Or in Azure Active Directory, you could set the preferred language property of the user. That will show up in their user profile as well. If you are creating a user account, then you just set the preferred language to what you want. If you're creating an Outlook account, then you can set the mailbox regional configuration. Let's move on in the last couple of minutes to machine translation. And I'll tell you a bit about the state of the art. So this is a package of sausages I found a couple of years ago, obviously machine translated. In English, it says Polish sausage. In French, it says polisser la saucisse, which means buff the sausage. The machine translation engine thought that it was polish the sausage and made that mistake. That is a very old machine translation engine of a type that Microsoft never used. What's even funnier is down here it says best before, and the French says meilleur auparavant, which means it used to be better. So translation engines have come a long way from these embarrassing and hilarious translations, which were very risky to use in a workplace. SharePoint had a machine translation service, and it was using the Bing text translator, similar to the early Bing translator, a statistical machine translator. The newer neural machine translation engines from Microsoft are much, much better than the old Bing translator, that the free Bing translator, the free Google translator that you can still use. What we have now is what we have been promised for decades, which is machine translation, which is as good and in some cases better than what humans can do. Human parity has been reached. What Microsoft calls human parity. Statistically, it's arguable whether it's human parity, but it is in blind tests, the quality of the translation is as good. And in one case, even better. The machine gets a better score for the quality of translation than human beings do. That just came out in August. That's not in production yet. It probably will be next year. So there are a number of different languages that have the human parity engine And these are coming out into production just this year. It's also possible to go even beyond that using custom translator. So you can retrain the neural machine translation models that Microsoft provides with your own documents so that it adopts your organization's style, your organization's vocabulary. You get very high quality translations like that. Microsoft also has made great strides in end-to-end speech translation. So it goes speech to text, then translation, then text to speech. It is excellent quality. They've optimized for the end-to-end translation quality. We are not quite yet at the point where you can safely use machine translation in all situations. You have to determine the risks, the level of quality that you need. So certain types of things you will never want to send to machine translation, even today. But we're now at the point where there's lots of content on your SharePoint sites where it is reasonably safe to use machine translation rather than humans. Anyway, this is, I'll leave some time for questions. Thank you very much. Liam, is there?
Perfect. Yeah, well, thank you, Martin. So one of the questions that was up there earlier was how to change page language without changing it in a user's profile.
So the page language, that it's going to depend on either the user's profile or the browser language. So you basically have to change one or the other. So
Okay.
if it is in your user profile, if there's something in your user profile, it's going to use that. If there's nothing in your user profile, it's going to use your browser. If there's nothing in your browser, it's going to use a site language.
Okay, perfect. And then somebody asked a question around the regional settings that are available in site scripts or site designs.
Yeah.
About how that works, about first week, day, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so the regional settings apply to date formats. They apply to currency. They apply to numbers. So different cultures have different ways of doing it. So that goes beyond language. It is separate from the language setting. You can have a regional setting in one language and a language setting in a different language. So you do that. Actually, modern sites are a lot better about adapting. Modern web parts are a lot better about adapting some date settings to the user's language and not just to the user's culture. So you have a setting somewhere in there in users' personal profiles. They can set their own regional settings. And there's a separate setting that says use the user's personal regional settings or use the site's setting. So the site can have a setting, the user can have a setting, and in the user's profile, there's an additional setting that says whether to use the user setting or to use the site setting. It's a little complicated, but it works.
I was going to say, it sounds like some voodoo magic of just click here, do this, do that until it eventually works.
There's some of that, but also if you're going to support this, you have to realize that users can set their own profiles and therefore unexpected things can happen, not based on anything that was done on the site, but done based on things users have done.
Sure. Okay.
So you may or may not want to give them that control.
Okay. So I have two more questions. The first one would be around migration. So if I'm migrating from classic to modern and I happen to have multilingual components in there, what's the process going to be? So let's say I'm an old on-premises and maybe I'm using variations in the old school way of doing it. What's the migration path, if anything?
So there are certain conditions where Microsoft will convert classic pages to modern. Mm-hmm. When it does that, it sometimes takes the localization with it and sometimes doesn't. It's from what I've done in the testing, certain elements actually it preserves a localization, and a few others it doesn't. So basically, if you're using Microsoft's feature, so for instance, if you're migrating a root site from classic to modern, or a root page on a site, it will actually convert it by itself and does a pretty good job, but it doesn't preserve all the localizations. For things like list names, column names, navigation, and so forth, it is identical in classic and modern. There are a few others where it is not. So for instance, if you had localized web part names, that doesn't work. Site names, that doesn't work in modern. And there was a little known feature, which is content editor web parts could differ from one language to the other, and that doesn't work in modern either.
Okay.
So certain lesser known features no longer supported in modern, or supported in a different way. But most of the features that have to do with lists and columns navigation, they're preserved, they work the same way.
Perfect. So just a general question then. So what's the performance impact with adding kind of translation type components into it? So, you know, let's say obviously from a SharePoint perspective, there is the capability to render the different strings to obviously match to the language. But let's say we're talking about content, if we're doing some kind of dynamic translation, what kind of performance are we looking at?
So for user interface, obviously it is just loading the correct thing. So the performance is the same, whatever the language is. It loads it in that language, but it's not a search and replace. It just loads it in that language in the first place. If you're doing content, it depends which way you're doing content. So, but typically typically you have different versions of the content in different places. So if you're for classic sites, if you're using variations, you're just going to a different site, loading a different page that has the same performance. Microsoft has been promising for a number of years to have some multilingual page features. We don't know how that's going to work, but it sounds like it's going to be limited to, well, we can speculate. I don't know. I don't know what it's
yeah, that's
so
right.
it's essentially going to show a different page. So no performance impact, as far as I could tell.
Okay. A specific question around product for you. Does the PointFire solution translate content after it gets rendered? So client-side translation?
The PointFire product, it translates beforehand. So it translates, stores it as a draft in your list or library, and then it will show you that content. So it's not dynamic on the fly. It is stored, goes through the same rules and life cycle as documents in other languages.
Perfect.
So it's machine translation, but it's stored.
Okay, perfect. And then one of the last questions is, can the global menu of the hub site be localized?
Yes, it can. It can. It's the thing is, yes, it is localized. The problem is seeing it being localized, because the global menu gets cached, and therefore you can put in your translation, go look at it, and it's not there. And that's because the version in the other language has been cached. You have to wait till the next day. But once you succeed in convincing it to refresh the cache, it is localized.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Well, that's all the questions. So thank you again, Martin, for joining us and for giving that great presentation on multilingual and the features that are available. It's always good to know. It's always been one of those dark art voodoo magic things of trying to figure out exactly how to get it to work and what's the best approach. Of course, we know that Microsoft is working on something, and as the way Microsoft do normally, it'll probably just appear one day and everybody will be like, "Ooh, look at this." And it may not work 100% the way we want, but Thank you for explaining some of those intricacies. Some of the comments I've seen back have been really grateful for you to explain which setting updates which setting and which one takes precedence and which one doesn't. I think that's half of the understanding that need to be done today.
And I wish it were simpler. It is actually more complex than I'm making it out to be, but this covers most cases.
Well, perfect. Well, we appreciate your time and thank you. And we thank you everybody for joining the webinar and hope you found it useful. And as a reminder, you'll receive an email with a link to the video and the slide deck also once we get everything back together. So you'll be able to go back over it in the future. But thank you again. And I'll close it now. It's right on the hour. That was perfect timing. So thank you again. And we'll see you at the next webinar.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.